So, hello, I'm James Ford, and I'm one of the teachers with the Empty Moon Zen Collective, and this is our Saturday morning. Today we are reflecting on the third of the three of the 10 grave precepts, something mysterious dealing with sex. I'd like to start with a case. There was an old woman who supported a hermit. For 20 years, she always had a girl take the hermit his food and went on and wait on him. One day, she told the girl to give the monk a close hug and ask, "What do you feel now?" The hermit responded in verse: "An old tree on a cold cliff, midwinter, no warmth." The girl went back and told this to the old woman. The woman said, "For 20 years I've supported this vulgar good for nothing." With this, she threw the monk out and burned the hermitage to the ground. This is case 154, if you care, in the Rinzai, Japanese Rinzai collection of koans called Entangling Vines. The version I gave you was my slight tweak of Thomas Kirchner's translation. Now, about 13 years ago, I wrote a book called If You're Lucky, Your Heart Will Break. And in it, I explored the precept, and I've kind of used the text that I wrote then as the bones for today's reflection. It appears that after 13 years, I may have gotten a tiny glimmer of insight into the matter, or not. You'll get to decide. Now, within Buddhism, historically, celibacy is actually encouraged among the laity, while in the Vinaya, the monastic rule, it's mandatory. The violation of this precept in traditional schools of Buddhism calls for immediate expulsion from the order. Within the Vinaya code, even a monk's unconscious ejaculation during sleep is considered a violation that requires confession before the community. It's unlikely that the emphasis on celibacy is informed by the second of the, it's likely that this emphasis on celibacy is informed by the second of the Four Noble Truths, often formulated as, quote, "the source of suffering is desire." And what stirs desire, burning longing in the human body and mind more than sex. There should be no doubt about the power of sex and sexuality. It can be intoxicating, overwhelming, all-consuming for both men and women. Although in general, perhaps a bit more so for men. We certainly can see how historically and across cultures, men's projection of sexual interest onto women has been the cause of much suffering for women. And we need to notice how our Zen precept regarding sex is the precept that has undergone the greatest shifts in perspective since it was first articulated in the Buddhist tradition. How we encourage sexuality and engage sexuality and disengage and discourage sexuality within our Zen communities today, particularly here in the West, is, well, complicated. As a deeply human issue, how sexuality is treated is one of Buddhism's great shadows. How despite its deeper teaching of radical interdependence and its constant focus on the importance of being present here now, as a radical non-duality, at the same time, a dualism persists between the body and the spirit. This can be seen in the way monasticism is deemed superior to lay life and the often harsh sexism that informs and, to my mind, poisons the traditional monastic rule itself. As Zen evolved within Chinese Buddhism and then migrated to those countries within the Chinese cultural hegemony, its largely unconscious and dualistic handling of sexuality barely shifted. Our lineage root teacher, Robert Aitken, once surveyed the range of koan literature and found a single case that addresses sexuality straight on. The one we just engaged from Entangling Vines, usually titled An Old Woman Burns Down a Hermitage. The case is powerful, compelling, and singular. And I promise, to which we will return. In addition to this koan, the Roshi notes some advice from Dogen, the founder of the Soto school in Japan, and perhaps Zen's greatest theologian, cautioning people to avoid sexual gossip. And that's pretty much the end of the list. Otherwise, it would seem sex doesn't exist. That is, sex didn't seem to exist until scholars noticed how rampant it actually was in Japanese Zen temples. As one dramatic example, both heterosexual and homosexual encounters were common among monastics outside the formal training periods. An even more morally complicated example, we know there are periods in Japanese Buddhist history where young novices often wore long hair and makeup and were the objects of sexually inspired conflict among the older monks. Later, as the temple system evolved and it became normative for single monks to occupy what would become tens of thousands of temples across the country, consorting with concubines quickly became normal. Finally, in the 19th century, this aspect of sexual conflict was formally acknowledged and mandatory celibacy was eliminated in Japanese Zen. There's an interesting corollary in Korea as well. Today, in our contemporary culture, the subject continues to be confused and people have considered considerable difficulties in engaging either sexuality in our culture or in their own sexual desires with anything approaching clarity. All we have to do is look at the litany of sexual scandals in our Western Zen sanghas to see how, well, we don't do sex well. Returning to Buddhist history, we see problems in how sex and sexuality is dealt with. There was always an internal conflict around assumptions of male superiority, a poison at the heart of the monastic community, and then there's the fact of the whole range of sexualities that naturally occur among human beings, with which we're dealing here in modernity, and how to deal with all these things in an open-hearted and open-minded way remains a conundrum. After all, however, we are being called to a manifestation of the awakened heart, the awakened mind, which expresses as not knowing, a profound openness and a deep curiosity. So, even assuming monogamy as the gold standard of human sexual relations is not absolutely certain, as contemporary advocates of polyamory would argue. What is certain here is that very little is certain, other than the fact that our human sexuality is more complex than we are often led to believe. The Korean missionary, the master Sung San, his call to only don't know, and knowing he himself would be caught up in sexual misconduct, for me at least, is a reminder that not knowing is a difficult and dangerous path. Against this background, we're called to address our own sexuality, our own presence as sexual beings, and how we carry this into our lived lives. These are the questions where the rubber hits the road. There are institutional problems. The number of sexual scandals that have racked Western Zen communities are too numerous to count. There is a generally agreed upon assumption that a Zen student should not be subject to sexual invitations from Zen teachers. I certainly agree with that. And I think there is more room for conversation about the gray areas than is generally acknowledged at this moment in our history. But What about the rest of our lives? In this Zen way, where our practice extends out into the broad highway of life, where we are not automatically expected to be a celibate, what does this precept mean? What does it mean to desire without desire? How do we live our lives on the way fully as sexual beings? And with that, let's return to the koan. People have pointed out that the koan has its own internal problems, not least of which is how the young girl's sexuality is used by the old woman, a clear transgression of the girl's person. So, no doubt we are treading on treacherous ground. Noting that the renowned 15th century Japanese Zen master Ikkyo Sojin, one of the few Zen teachers to openly deal with sex, wrote about this koan. Quote, "The old woman's kindness was like lending a ladder to a thief. Thus to the pure monk she gave a girl as wife. Tonight, if a beautiful woman were to entwine with me, a withered willow would put forth fresh spring growth." In some translation, that withered willow sprouting is even more, how do I say, graphic. Clearly, here is a naturalistic spirituality calling us to be fully engaged with who we are. This is not an advocacy, however, for libertinism. Absolutely, we need to understand constraint. We need to know time and place. We are called to growth and depth and the miracles of change. But you cannot start any of that without knowing who you are. Any should has to follow an acknowledgement of what is. And discerning what is, well, an extremely difficult project. And saying difficult is, well, understating the problem. Pontius Pilate is not the only person to stumble with that question, what is truth? We need to know ourselves. We cannot practice Zen, a spirituality of presence, without bringing our whole selves into the great matter. That which is part of us and which we deny will inevitably return to haunt us, a hungry ghost of our own night longing. Much, maybe the whole of our project is one of clarification, of noticing, of being aware, of opening our eyes to what is and who we are. And nowhere is this work more true than in how we encounter our sexuality. Our invitation on this way in every aspect of encountering ourselves and the world is to not turn away. Here, with sex and sexuality and the precept, it is just as true, if a bit more in one's face, if a bit more difficult, perhaps, than many of the other precepts. And as we open ourselves, our hearts, and from this perspective allow our bodies to be bodies, we will find the ways of restraint and letting go that become a joyful dance within reality. So, a bit of good news. The way is broad, the way is vast, and thankfully, there is room for all of us exactly as we are.